The moment the clash of axes stopped was when the true nightmare began. Not for the men left lifeless on the ground. My father, my brother. Their pain had ended in the blood-soaked grass. The nightmare was for us, the women who survived. They say a northern warrior lusts for gold and silver. They lied. Their true prize was us. I remember the smell of that day. It was not the scent of damp earth after rain or the familiar smoke from the hearth. It was the sharp, metallic smell of fresh blood and the sweat of strangers. The smell of ash from the burned-out monastery at Clonmacnoise, where 43 monks were cut down before the altar. The chronicler recorded the number, then fell silent about the fate of the village women. But that silence was more terrifying than any scream. Because we did not vanish, we were taken. My wrist was cold from the iron shackle. It wasn't forged for a warrior, but for a woman. I could feel it in its rough-hewn curves, fitted so snugly it drew blood. Around me, my sisters, my neighbors, all shared the same chains. The smaller children had their ankles bound, the iron rings cruelly, impossibly small. We were herded like cattle, away from the smoking ruins of our homes, towards the coast where the longships waited like sea serpents. None of us spoke a word. There was only the sound of the children's sobs and the drag of iron on the earth. The eyes of the Northmen were cold, calculating. They didn't see us as people. We were commodities. I saw one man point to Alara's red hair and nod, another check a young girl's teeth as if inspecting a horse. Our value was determined by age, health, and the ability to bear children. 20 silver pieces for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 for one injured during capture. These figures, I would later learn, were carved into runestones as far away as Schleswig, receipts in stone for stolen souls. The ship reeked of a terrible stench, rotting fish, unwashed bodies, and the sour tang of fear. We were forced below deck into a cramped, dark space. The sea slammed against the hull like fists, and with every lurch of the vessel, my stomach churned. We huddled together, unable to stretch our legs, the darkness so complete I could only hear the breathing and whimpers of those beside me. It was a journey without day or night, only the oppressive black and the chill of the sea seeping into our bones. When the hatch was finally thrown open, the sudden light made me flinch. The smell of land hit me, but it was not the smell of home. This was the smell of Dublin, or Dyflin, as our captors called it. A chaotic mix of fish, damp timber, and the filth of a crowded port. And that is where I first saw it. The slave market at Wood Quay. It was unlike any market I had ever known. Instead of stalls of vegetables or cloth, there were wooden platforms where human beings were displayed. Stone warehouses built not for cargo, but for human cargo. I saw women from all lands, the fair hair of Saxons, the sun-darkened skin of Franks. They stood there, empty, as buyers walked past, inspecting, haggling. A brutal, chillingly efficient supply chain. Weekly ships brought in fresh captives. The young were sent to Norse farms. The older were shipped east, down the Russian rivers to the slave markets of the Islamic world. They separated us. I tried to hold on to Alara's hand, but the butt of a spear struck me away. I was shoved towards a different section. A tall warrior, his blonde hair in braids, his beard thick, was watching me. His eyes were the color of ice, devoid of emotion. He circled me, then abruptly seized my chin, forcing my head up. "Kona," he said, a single word in his foreign tongue. I did not know what it meant, but I understood his gaze. It was the look of an owner at his property. Property that breathes. Kona, breathing property. That was its meaning. I was not his wife, not his servant. I was a possession, as lawfully his as the horse he rode or the axe at his hip. Their laws, the Grágás codes, were explicit. The claim had to be declared before 3 witnesses within 3 days of capture. I remember that moment. Hakon dragged me into the center of the settlement, before his fellow warriors, and announced his ownership. No one asked my name. My resistance was irrelevant. My consent was non-existent. The assault was not merely tolerated, it was codified into law. Life in Hakon's longhouse was a blur of endless, gray days. By day, I worked with the other captive women, grinding grain, curing hides, mending the thick woolen tunics that reeked of sweat and smoke. We moved in silence, ghosts from a lost life. By night, I was his. There was no escape. Every door was barred, and the surrounding wilderness was more terrifying than these wooden walls. But forced marriage was not the worst fate. That truth was revealed on a bleak afternoon when Brigid, a girl from Port Mael Ruba, tried to flee. They caught her at the edge of the forest. They did not kill her outright. A quick death was a mercy they did not grant to the defiant. They dragged her to a pre-dug hole just outside the palisade. A punishment pit. We were forced to watch. It was stone-lined, only 6 feet deep, and 3 feet across, too small to lie flat, too shallow to stand upright. Before they threw her in, they took an iron club and broke both of her legs, the dry, sickening crack of bone still haunting my sleep. It was so she could not climb out, they said. Then they shattered her arms so she could not take her own life. Brigid did not scream. She just looked at us, her eyes wide, a blank stare that held all the horror in the world. They left her there, crouched in agony, in the rain and the Sunday. We could hear her whimpers for days, growing fainter, until there was only silence. Death came slowly, from thirst, infection, or exhaustion. It wasn't just an execution. It was a lesson, a message sent to all of us. This was the price of defiance. Months later, I realized I was with child. It was not a joy, but a new kind of terror. What would be the fate of this child, born of violence? Viking law was clear. If the mother was a slave, the child was a slave. If the child could not work, the child was killed. A brutal economics. I had seen the rubbish heaps at the edge of the settlement, and sometimes I caught glimpses of what looked like tiny, white bones. I gave birth on a bitter winter's night. A son. I named him Finn, a name from home that I whispered to him only when no one could hear. Hakon looked at the infant, not with a father's pride, but with the appraisal of a farmer eyeing a newborn calf. Was it healthy? Would it be useful? I held Finn to my chest, feeling his tiny warm body, and a cold dread washed over me. My love for him was my greatest weakness. Every day he lived was a day I lived in fear, knowing his life was subject to a whim, to whether he cried too loudly, to whether he was strong enough to one day become a valuable commodity. I had escaped the punishment pit, only to fall into a different hell, one where hope and fear were so intertwined they choked me from the inside out. The years passed in a fog of submission. Finn grew, a quiet boy with my eyes, learning to navigate his father's world without drawing notice. But then, the winds shifted. News arrived from England. A great battle at Brunanburh. 5 kingdoms had united to defeat the Northern Army. Their dominance was cracking. For the first time in years, I felt a fragile sliver of hope. But hope, in this world, is a poison. Defeat brought fear to men accustomed to victory. Panic spread through the settlement like a plague. They did not fear death in battle. They feared what came after. They feared what the victors would do to their wives and daughters. Because they knew. They knew exactly what it was. For generations, they had been the inflictors of that very terror. And now, faced with their own defeat, they turned those same methods inward. The decision was made in a closed council of the men. Their voices, low and grim, carried through the wooden walls of the longhouse. None of their women would be taken alive. None of their children would become slaves to their enemies. That night, Håkon entered our quarters, his face a mask of stone. He did not look at me. He looked only at Finn, who was asleep on his deerskin pallet. He knelt, and for one terrifying moment, I thought he was going to harm the boy. But he only stroked his hair, a gesture of impossible gentleness. Then he stood, and his gaze finally met mine. In those icy blue eyes, for the first time, I saw something other than ownership. It was despair. "Better this way," he whispered. In my own tongue. Words he had learned over the years. I didn't understand. But then I heard the first scream from a nearby longhouse. Not the scream of battle. It was a woman's scream. Cut brutally short. The truth hit me like an axe blade. This was not a panicked massacre. It was an organized extermination. Fathers ending the lives of their daughters. Husbands executing their wives. A grim mirror of the terror they had once unleashed on others. They came for me. Håkon stood aside. 2 other men held me down. A third held a wooden cup. The smell was overpowering. A sickly sweet herbal scent. Henbane. They forced my mouth open and poured the liquid down my throat. I struggled, but it was useless. My body began to seize. My vision blurring. The last thing I saw was Håkon holding Finn. The boy was awake, confused. Håkon held him close, his face buried in his son's hair. I saw his shoulders shake. Then he carried Finn out, towards the mass grave they had already dug at Repton. My consciousness faded. Darkness claimed me, but sound remained the scrape of shovels on dirt as they began to bury us, the living and the dead together. I felt the body of another woman fall on top of me, cold. In my final moments, a strange, clear thought pierced the fog. Someone, one of those men perhaps, would later carve an inscription onto the skull of a young girl in this very grave. 3 words in their tongue. Betra sva. Better this way. A justification, an explanation to themselves. But for me, lying in the cold dark, buried under the weight of my fallen sisters, there was no justification. There was only the final silence. The silence the chroniclers never recorded, but to which the bones would forever testify.